reflexión y formación en torno a la didáctica del español como lengua extranjera.
Welcome everyone to another episode of Reflections on Teaching and Learning Spanish as a Foreign Language. I'm your host, Miguel García. Today's episode is different. We're talking directly to you, English-speaking learners from Oregon from the US West Coast, who are on our journey to improve the Spanish pronunciation. And to guide us today, we have the Spanish teacher Carlos Triana, who has a major in English and Spanish as a foreign language, who has worked closely with a learner from Oregon and has valuable insights to share. Carlos, welcome.
Thank you, Miguel. It's a pleasure to be here talking about these meaningful experiences that I have had teaching Spanish. These reflections had allowed me to understand how our accent influences the way we pronounce Spanish and how becoming aware of this can make a huge difference in the process of learning.
Carlos, let's begin with the foundation. What it is so important for learners from Oregon to understand the characteristics of their own English barrier before working on Spanish pronunciation?
Great question, Miguel. When you come from Oregon or the west coast of the US, you bring very specific features of your English variety that directly shape the way you pronounce Spanish. And being aware of these features is the first step to improve the pronunciation, to understand others and make yourself understand in Spanish, focusing on the efficiency of communication. However, let me give you some examples to clarify this view. So first, we have the merger of the vowels A and O. For many speakers in Oregon, words like cut and cat sound exactly the same. Both vowels collapse into one, but in Spanish, A and O must always be different. So for example, casa has the vowel A while cosa has the vowel O. And this can never sound the same. If a learner merges them, they might say casa when they mean cosa, simply because their English system pushes both vowels toward a single category. On the other hand, we have the tenser and higher sound. In Oregon English, the vowel in cat is very tense, sometimes almost sounding like cat, but in Spanish, A should always be relaxed, very open, without that tension. So when an Oregon learner says a Spanish word like cama or cata, they might accidentally add that tight English quality, and the vowel ends up sounding unnatural or too sharp. Another characteristic is the retract E sound. In English, words like bed or sit, where many Oregon speakers pronounce that vowel farther back in the mouth, Spanish has something different, because it has a very forward and clear E. So when you say si or vino in Spanish, the tongue must be right at the front, not pulled back like in English bit, So, finally we have the fronting of U and the diphthong OU, right? In English, especially on the West Coast, the vowel in tu, it's often produced quite front, more like tu, right? But in Spanish, tu must be a back vowel with rounded lips and not forward movement. And for O, English usually ends with a glide, like this glide, like go, yeah? But Spanish vowels are here, we will see a little bit more of this later. But now let's continue. So Spanish words like goma or tomo should stay completely steady on that single vowel, without sliding toward another sound at the end, right? So all of these differences may seem small, but they have a huge impact on your Spanish pronunciation. When Oregon learners understand these contrasts between English and Spanish, they become much more aware of what needs to change, and that phonological awareness is the foundation for real improvement.
Thank you, Carlos. Now let's talk about the practical side. What are the main vowel and consonant challenges that Oregon learners tend to face when speaking Spanish?
Well, Miguel, now talking about vowels and consonants specifically, one of the first things Oregon learners need to understand is that Spanish vowels are pure and stable, as I have mentioned before. So in short, they don't move, right? That, keep that in mind. For example, an Oregon speaker might say something like no in English with that glide, that glide that at the end is with the OU, as I mentioned before, and then they bring that same light into Spanish, pronouncing no as no. But in Spanish, it must stay completely flat, as I have mentioned before. So this is something that you're gonna get from this podcast, right? But now talking about consonants, we have a similar effect. Oregon English also influences Spanish consonant pronunciation in quite a few ways. Let me give you some clear examples. First, learners often replace the Spanish Y with the English J, right? So a word like pollo in Spanish, which traditionally has the Y sound in some varieties, like pollo, might be pronounced as pollo, right? And sometimes with that late, more likely like English, right? Like yo-yo. But, like even in words like llama, right? That is pronounced with this effect that must be pronounced like llama, right? So we have this type of cases where we must be conscious about the way we are pronouncing it, influenced by our first language. However, also you have this problem with R. I know that this is something really common with native speakers, mostly for those that are coming from English, because of the way that R it's pronounced in English, and also how we have to switch in Spanish, right? And yeah, that's why many Oregon learners use the English R instead of the Spanish tap or trill, right? And yeah, there are some words like, for example, pero, sometimes could be pronounced like pero, using the English R as, like as we pronounce it in red in English, right? Or instead of caro, it comes like caro. So this is, completely different, and somehow we can see the identity of the sound in Spanish, because the Spanish R is produced with the tongue hitting the alveolar ridge and not curling back like in English, right? Another aspect is that in Oregon, English speakers tend to aspirate the voiceless stops in consonants like P, T, or K. So instead of papa, right, which should start with a crisp, unaspirate P, they may say something like papa, or taco, like taco, instead of saying taco, right? Papa, taco. Well, maybe you are wondering why papa and no papa, right? Yeah, later we will see a little bit more of action and the stress of the word, how can also change the meaning with some words in Spanish like termino. But now let's keep with this feature that we are mentioning now. But finally, right, now talking about consonants, we have something really interesting with this sound of she in Spanish. So for example, Oregon speaker, must pronounce something like chico, like chico, because in English the sh sound, it's very common and automatic, right? It also happens in words like mucho, that it will be like mucho, and yeah, so yeah, it's kind of funny sometimes to repeat this type of words. Actually, I'm trying not to laugh when I'm pronouncing them. However, this is part of the exercise, because sometimes, this is another tip that I have learned studying languages, because for sure I say that I will never learn English completely. I still have thousands, and also with Spanish, as a native speaker in Spanish, I have thousands of things to learn in Spanish and also in English. And yeah, this is the wonderful thing, and this is what I choose languages, as as part of my job. So yeah, so that's why we need to be open to experiment. That's why we need to be open to listen, and also to practice. Yeah, sometimes I know that could be kind of funny, but it's something really important, right? Remember that this is a learning process, and we really need to be patient with ourselves. However, improvement absolutely happens step by step, especially when we follow Professor Juana Hill's 3-phase cycle for pronunciation work. Remember, awareness, control repetition, and free production. Also, we will see these these 3 phases in 2 contexts. But first, let me explain these phases in a simple and practical way. So for the first phase, awareness, the goal is to train your ear before trying to train your mouth. This means listening carefully to the sounds that are difficult for you and learning to distinguish them. For example, listening to pairs like pero and perro, right? Or casa and cosa, as we mentioned before, and trying to identify which one you hear. You can also use resources like Sounds of Speech to watch how the tongue and lips move in Spanish compared to English. And at this stage, you don't need to speak too much, right? You just need to recognize, compare, and start noticing differences. That's the foundation. In the second phase, control repetition, you now try to imitate those sounds in a very guided way. This is where you repeat words, short phrases and minimal pairs. Always focusing on accuracy. For example, practicing ta ta ta, ta ta ta, for stress, or repeating like pollo, 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 like trying to repeat like, okay, this sounds more like in the English collocation, this sounds more like Spanish, like allow yourself to experiment, allow yourself to learn, and just be patient. So this is also the moment to record yourself, slow down, exaggerate the movement if that's necessary. That's what I mentioned, that sometimes is really funny, and ask your teacher for corrections, right? It's good if maybe you can show the record to your teacher or even to a native speaker. So that's nice, and also maybe someone that you can feel comfortable with sharing this type of things. But you are not trying to speak fast, you are trying to speak clearly and accurately, right? And well, actually I will mention more than talking like accurately. I will say that because in languages the most important thing is communication. So it's like accurately in the ways of communication that you can be understood, but at the same time that you can feel comfortable in the way you are communicating, right? So finally, the third phase is free production, where you start using those difficult sounds naturally in real communication. This might include short dialogues, reading a short text aloud, doing shadowing exercises with a podcast, or even creating your own short recordings. The idea is to integrate the sounds into meaningful language use, so they stop being isolated exercises and become part of how you actually speak Spanish. This is where the pronunciation begins to feel more automatic, right? And one last piece of advice, don't hesitate to ask your teacher for clarification whenever you feel unsure about a sound. Because something that I have noticed is that, some students sometimes are like, I don't like to use the expression afraid, right? It's more like shy, like, also it happens a little bit more in my experience as a Colombian teacher working with foreigners, because I think that this is also something intercultural. In Colombia, we are really open to ask. Like, sometimes when I start a class in Colombia, all of the Colombian students are like, hey, are you single? How tall are you? But sometimes when I'm starting a class with foreigners, I would say my short experience, they are really shy and they don't ask. So also, this is part of the communication in the classroom, where somehow like some foreigners don't want you to work more, but somehow, I don't know, at least in my experience here with other Colombians, it's okay if we work a little bit more, right? And it's okay. Like, I also like to see how the student also it feels free to ask me questions, like also to ask us for recommendation and others, like tools that can allow, like the development of his competences in Spanish. So just like don't hesitate to ask your teacher and try to have this communication, because this is something that you somehow need to develop individually, but at some point it's important that someone can give you feedback, right? And also could be like, as I mentioned before, a friend, a native speaker, but somehow like maybe a professional person who have who has been like dealing with this can give you a deeper feedback, okay? So pronunciation improves much faster when you receive clear feedback and when you use these three phases consistently.
Wonderful tips. I have read the work of this professor. I agree with you. These phrases are important for this type of phonological and phonetic idioms. However, many learners struggle with stress and reading. How does Oregon English influence this?
Exactly, Miguel, and this becomes even more important when we talk about suprasegmental features, things like stress, rhythm, and intonation, because English and Spanish work completely differently. English is stress-timed, meaning some syllables are strong and others get reduced, but Spanish, on the other hand, is syllable-timed, and every syllable has more or less like the same weight, right? This is something that we have talked before when we say that, when we said that syllables in Spanish are pure. Oh my gosh, this is something that I really struggled with when I was learning English. Well, I'm still learning for sure. That's something that I was gonna say. But I mean, when I was learning English from scratch, oh my god, because for example, in my experience, I didn't know anything about English when I started my university classes, and I was supposed to, be fluent in English. And the first day of class, somebody asked me hey, how are you? And I just say, yes, I didn't know anything. This is just to show you my English level. So when I have to learn the meaning of the words, but also just as my first exercise of English, just noticing that every single vowel or consonants, had some particular phonic rules. I had to really study a lot. I had to practice, and also not only repetition. I also will talk a little bit about it later. But yeah, also it's the idea to use it in a natural speech, right? Because sometimes we are doing repetition. That's good, but the good point is when we can put it into practice in real conversations. Well, so yeah, again, talking about this type of things, I must say that Oregon learners often misplace stress. They don't clearly distinguish tonic and aphonic syllables, and they bring in English speech patterns, especially rising intonation in statements or exaggerated falling tones in short phrases. That's why we really need Professor Hill's phases here again. And this first part that I mentioned before, the awareness, this is basically called by her sensitization, and control repetition and free practice. Let me explain how each phase works for suprasegmentals. So first, sensitization, it's something that I always suggest with activities that help you to notice how Spanish stress and rhythm actually sound, where you don't have to speak yet. You just train your ear. I always say to my students, the students who are learning English and also the students who are learning Spanish, the importance of how listening skills are directly connected with the speaking skills, right? I say if you can, read this, not fast, but if you can read this sentence as a sentence and not word by word, because of assimilation, because of other phonological elements include, that means that you can understand it. Because sometimes when we are learning a language, we just get used to get words. Oh my gosh, I understood carro, I understood colegio, I understood escuela, right? But we are not on, we are celebrating that we understand one word of the native speaker. However, we are ignoring the whole sentence, and this is connected with our phonological awareness to see all of these suprasegmental elements. For example, you can listen to pairs like papá and papa, and also práctico y practicó, and try to identify where the stress falls without looking at written word. You can also clap or tap out the rhythm of short sentences to feel that each syllable in Spanish has the same duration, also with long sentences. Well, not that long, but something complete yo quiero comida, instead of the English reduction I want food, so yeah, this is the beautiful thing about learning. So I think that sometimes could be stressful, but yeah, with these students that I have had experience, I have also learned with them a lot about myself, a lot about Spanish, and also it's been an exchange of linguistical knowledge, and this is really cool. And also another helpful exercise is listening to native speakers. As I said before, if you have native speaker friends, you can mark arrows showing how the pitch moves in Spanish questions, statements, and exclamations. This helps you, to say, okay, Spanish yes, no questions, in this case, don't rise as much as in English ones, or Spanish doesn't reduce vowels the way English does, right? So the goal here is simple, just notice the difference, right? As I said before, sensitization is just crucial. Listen, be patient, and then just, this gives you how to practice with sense, right? Because if you start repeating words without any sense and without analyzing before, well, I don't know if that's gonna work at all. Well, in the second phase, now on this element, phase control repetition, you start producing the stress and rhythm patterns yourself, but still in a very guided way. This is where you imitate, repeat, and practice with a structure, right? For example, you can repeat minimal stress pairs after your teacher or after a recording like público, publicó, publico, different types of stress, right? Or practice pattern sentences that highlight tonic and atonic syllables, such as la cama es cómoda, You can also read short phrases aloud while exaggerating the Spanish rhythm, keeping each syllable evenly timed and avoiding English-style reductions like turning pero into pero. Another great tool is shadowing listening to a native recording and repeating it real time, following the speaker's stress in pitch as closely as possible. This helps train your prosthetic muscle memory. At this stage, you're still focusing on accuracy, not fluency. And finally, in the third phase, free practice. Practice a lot, but try to find real patterns in real communication. That's what I mean. Because, I know that all of these approaches look a little bit, traditional, right? So that's why somehow we need to connect, we need to join the tradition with the modern methods, right? So that's we can learn this type of elements into the speech. So something really cool that we can do here is that, and also that I'm gonna mention later too, it's like a muscle that has somehow memory to follow certain patterns. It's like what I said to a student, if you go to the gym, the first exercises are difficult to do, and then after practicing, somehow your muscles are doing the exercises without any problem, and somehow your body is moving along. It's like when you're practicing a new sport, and then somehow it's the same thing. Then at the beginning you're overthinking every movement, but then your body is moving by itself. And it happens at dancing, it happens in many other things, and somehow, according to some authors like Hill, somehow our tongue and our elements connected with communication and when we talk are the same. They are gonna have somehow following some patterns that they are gonna do unconsciously, and that's the way, and basically that's what we can do, right? So for this type of exercising, this could be reading, a paragraph aloud while concentrating on keeping the rhythm, syllable time, or recording yourself telling a short story and then checking if your stress matches the Spanish patterns. You can also create mini dialogues and, with the vocabulary you are learning, and make sure you say each word with its correct tonic syllable. But the idea is to integrate these prosodic features naturally into your speech, so they stop being exercises and become part of the way you actually communicate. This is what I was saying before. And of course, one last piece of advice, always, as I said before, ask your teacher and try to have a guidance somehow, try to have direct feedback. I think that every person you talk, it's a different experience, and also this enrich a lot your process of learning, a language. But if you have a teacher, maybe can give you also some deeper advice, as I always said. And as I always say, sorry. And yeah, so getting that feedback early prevents fossilization later.
Wonderful. What are the sources you recommend its owner audience wants to get deeper into this type exercise?
Of course, Miguel, if any of our listeners want to go deeper into these pronunciation exercises, there are several tools that can really support your progress. Sounds of speech is fantastic for understanding how each Spanish sound is physically produced, and applications like Speechline and Mondly give you how can I say, this is structured practice and personalized feedback that I was talking about before. And also you can strengthen your ear by listening to audiobooks like podcasts and music in Spanish every day. Oh my gosh, this is really important. Also, this is something that I have learned a lot working on my master degree with the professor who is in charge of my project. Because somehow I'm researching about phonological awareness and also talking about interculturation. And basically according to the authors I have read, this is super important. Somehow the way we speak and the way we communicate, it's connected with as I said before, our brain also has memory, and it's something that we can allow ourselves to talk, in this way that we can think in the language naturally, without forcing. But this require somehow what do we give to what content do we get, no? So that's the importance of trying whatever we like. This is another advice to finish, right? But basically it's if you love podcasts and these podcasts are part of your daily routine, listen to podcasts in Spanish. Somehow try to switch that daily routine into the language you're learning. So for example, in my case, I love reading. So something that I just start doing is that I start reading books in English, right? But in this case, I need pronunciation. So also in my case, I belong to many different groups, and I have to play instruments and I have to sing. So also I try to switch into music in English. Somehow I always listen to music in English, so that was a part of me. And somehow now reflecting about my experience learning languages, I think that music is a super great tool that allows me to understand the language, not only in phonological aspects, also about cultural. Also I learn slangs, also I learn assimilation, in terms of these phonic things. And also varieties, how somehow singers of different regions have certain pronunciation, and somehow this is something that you're learning unconsciously, right? But you can use the application I mentioned before. And finally, try to compare different varieties of Spanish. That this language had many different changes because of history, because of politics, because of the mixtures of cultures, and this is wonderful. I love Spanish language, and it's always a pleasure to talk about this type of topics. And this allows us to develop our intercultural awareness, and also it gives us flexibility as speakers, right? So thanks for allowing me to be here on this podcast, and hope that somehow this content can be helpful for the listeners, as somehow it's been super helpful to me and meaningful sharing these experiences and learning with you guys.
Thanks, Carlos. I think that all of your reflections are meaningful to assist Spanish learners from Oregon to faster the process of learning and acquiring a better phonic competence when speaking Spanish. Thank you. Thank you to all our listeners from Oregon. Remember, pronunciation is about clarity, confidence, and intercultural awareness. See you in the next episode. Take care.